Daniel, you're a man of books. You've read books. You've written some books even. And you've given some thought to what's been going on in our communities, in our country. What's your take on the last 8 to 10 years?
Right. Well, the most recent book that I wrote isn't supposed to be responding solely to the last 8 to 10 years, but I'm not sure if it would be possible to have written it without what's gone on, especially in Christian communities.
Hmm.
Uh, I arrived at my current position at John Brown University in the fall of 2016, and I've been around Christian higher education in the past. I went to a small Christian college as an undergraduate, felt the call to come back and teach in that kind of an environment. Had never been to Arkansas when I interviewed out here, and got here in August. And had a little bit of time before the election to kind of ease into the culture a little bit, try to get my feet wet. The night of the election, like so many folks, started to see some of the early returns out of Florida and elsewhere and thought, man, I think they may have gotten this wrong. It looks like
Hmm.
it's really overperforming in some of these places. And, went to bed. I'm an early to bed person, pretty confident that, Trump would be winning in an upset. And sure enough, that's what happened. Got to campus the next day and, I'm a political scientist. So some of my first thoughts were not about the reaction to the election, but more about how do we miss this, right? What was the
Hmm.
doing? How were we so wrong? And I get to class thinking this is what my students are going to want to talk about. It's not what they wanted to talk about.
Hmm.
Uh, a lot of students were upset. Some of them were crying and had been crying. Other students were subtly and almost not sure how to be positive, or at least they're excited, but they didn't want to be too excited in that kind of
Hmm.
moment.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that was an early introduction to what the next decade would look like, where you get a lot of emotion, positive and negative, hinging on political outcomes.
Hmm.
Uh, 2016 didn't lead to this in Christian communities, but in many ways exemplified and kind of was the pinnacle of these political reactions. And we've only seen these, increase in our communities over the last couple of election cycles leading into November. So getting back to your original question, Caleb, I'm not sure, how to make sense of all of this. I write in the book Uneasy Citizenship that, a lot of this is to blame on political polarization and negative partisanship and a tendency for people to put their, political identities front and center and find alliances and allegiances with those of us, those who agree with us on politics, even superseding the alliances and the allegiances we should have with our brothers and sisters in Christ in the church. Um, Research is pretty consistent on that, and what that means for the next, few years or few decades. Those are the big questions, or what I'm most interested in as a political scientist.
So we have this big, well, I guess what a lot of people call a big upset in 2016. A lot of folks did not see this coming. I remember, for me, I had stepped into the lead pastor role in the fall of 2015 and thought I knew what I was getting into. 20 that election happened, and I remember very similar experience going to work the next day. Two of my teammates are out in the parking lot crying. I go in the office. Two of my teammates are in the office celebrating. And this the very vivid reactions. It was almost like no one had a neutral reaction. It was very happy or very sad, very energized and very afraid. And within the church and within homes and even within neighborhoods, there's been a lot of folks who've they've sorted themselves out into communities where I just want to be with the people who are happy about this, or I just want to be with people who are afraid of this, or vice versa. How does because you're not only a poli-sci guy, you're also like a Jesus follower. How do you think the scriptures guide us in how we think about our political alliances, our political leanings?
So one of the big lessons that I take from Jesus in trying to make sense of today's political environment, and that's always dangerous, right? Because Jesus is not operating in a 21st century American political environment. But you look who he surrounds himself with, right? His disciples are of varied backgrounds and occupations and classes. They're not cut from the same cloth. He, drew on people with different skill sets and different personality types, people who were at least, if not ignored, certainly reviled by Jews of the day. And so that's instructive to some sense that Jesus didn't surround himself with people who thought, like him. And it's impossible for him to do that because he's the Son of God. He's fully God, fully man. He's
Right.
kind of one of one, right? So I think that's one useful instruction, though, is a tendency to maybe to push back against sorting ourselves into these homogenous or echo chambery environments.
Hmm.
On the one hand, that's pretty psychologically comforting for us. I ask my students all the time, how many of you, surround yourself with friends who constantly push back against you and are constantly disagreeing with you or calling you out? And inevitably, one student will say, "Well, I argue with my friends." And I say, "Well, that's different than having people tell you all the time you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong." We don't do
Right.
that, right?
Yeah.
I don't think we could operate like that. That's not how we're wired. But I think it's possible too to take that to a different extreme where we only surround ourselves with people who think like us, who agree like us. And this is kind of the blessing and the curse of the American religious landscape, especially for Christians. Uh, we have been so fortunate to, as Christians, operate in an environment that's kind of a religious marketplace of sorts, where churches act and operate free from government interference. They can innovate, to use business language. They can draw in consumers and potential converts, but at the same time, that leads to just this explosion of different traditions and types of churches within the evangelical tradition. So even here in Siloam Springs, Arkansas, you have the more, I would say, not necessarily negatively, stuffy, liturgically oriented churches, the non-denominational fog machine style churches. And then within those types of traditions, you're going to have the political and cultural environments of those churches. So you can kind of choose your own adventure as an American Christian today, especially if you live in an area with more than a handful of churches at your disposal. And that can be a blessing, but it can also be a real problem when we can just start to insulate and be around people that only think the way that they do. I don't think that's the way Jesus envisions the church. I don't think that's the way that we should think about the church, in a big kingdom sense. Uh, and so that's something I think we have to be conscious of and be pushing back against our tendency for comfort in those
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah. Spiritual growth often feels like frustration, disappointment, anger, sadness, confusion. It's like going to the gym, right? If you're not sweating, you're not doing it right. And if you're not around people who are different than you in your faith journey, uh, you're not sweating.
Yeah, no, I think that's well put. And I should also clarify too, it's okay to be frustrated. Like with my students who are frustrated or excited about electoral outcomes, that just affirms that elections do have consequences, right? With your coworkers who were both really upset, but then also really glad or satisfied with the outcome. We shouldn't just take this ascetic approach and say, "Oh, whatever happens, happens.
Right.
Let's,
Right.
we can just rise above this." We can believe that elections matter and policies matter and who's serving in government matters, but at the same time, remembering what the main thing really is and
Mm-hmm.
putting our
Mm-hmm.
confidence there rather than in these 4 and 6 year increments of
Yeah.
electoral outcomes.
It's good. So, Daniel, you know that there's this movement that seems to be gaining steam. American Christian nationalism is this, thinking about it as a political ideology. There's a group of folks who are trying to say that Christians should rise up, bind themselves together, and take over the government, or that it should only be Christians in charge, or some version of that. That we should take power so that we Christians can, become a godly people again, or have righteous laws, or something like that, some argument like that. You have given this some thought. You've written about citizenship and how following Jesus can impact that. Is that the right thing to do? The like Christian nationalism stuff? Should we do that?
I think we as Christians should seek to influence government in ways that are consistent with and certainly align with our views on faith and morality and even religious convictions, in the sense that everyone else does, right? It's impossible to divorce our views on the good life and what would mean the flourishing of our communities from how we vote, right? We can't separate those things. I do think there's a big difference between Christians saying, I'd prefer a government that is consistent with my views on X, Y, and Z. That's one perspective. There's another perspective that's different than saying we're going to privilege Christianity in the legal system. We are only going to elect Christians to these positions. We believe that Christianity or some element of Christianity should be the official, state religion that informs policies. Those are different things. And our constitutional system is set up in a way that encourages diversity and pluralism. And by and large, I think it's worked really, really well throughout our history. I think there's arguments that it's led to some challenges or problems, but this very small but vocal element of Christian nationalism in the United States is different than a wide swath of evangelicals who say, well, why wouldn't I want the government to promote Christian values? What if my Christian values are protecting the vulnerable? Or I think one of the problems is when we equate any type of Christian or religious perspective on, say, abortion or gender and say, well, that's just Christian nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
That waters it down and actually weakens what Christian nationalism really, really is. Because I think it's very sensible for Christians to take, say, a pro-life perspective and not want to force people into Christianity by threat of legal, coercion. Right? Mm-hmm. Those are very different things. So no, I would not identify as a Christian nationalist, even though I would prefer a government that certainly advances Christian principles, because I think Christian principles are true, as long as we go through the right means and process of doing these things.
So even that statement I found to be a little bit, folks are using the statement Christian values as if we're all agreeing what those are.
Right.
So I am a non-denominational theological evangelical in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. And I'm surrounded by Methodists, Lutherans, Anglican, Presbyterians, Catholics, Armenian Orthodox. And we all have different ideas of how a church should be run, how you should do the sacraments, how we should engage in spiritual disciplines and things like that. And we find ourselves not agreeing on values. It does seem to me like that statement, Christian values, usually means in practice, right to life or some version of pro-life something about marriage and a definition about marriage. And also weirdly like free market capitalism, small government, right? I'm noticing those get put in there. School choice, I heard just the other day that school vouchers is a Christian value. Gun rights, I've heard, is a Christian value. Is that, are those Christian values? Are we using that term to just mean my values?
Yeah. So when I said Christian values, obviously, I think this is going to differ from, people in different Christian traditions. Certainly if you're a white evangelical, you're going to have a different read on Christian values than, say, a black Protestant or a black brothers and sisters in the church. And that's part of the reason why I wrote this book, is to say it's not that we should look at Christians who vote for certain candidates or with certain parties and then either acknowledge or anoint them as part of the team or distance ourselves from them as being on the wrong side, just because of the great diversity of the body. Um, I might disagree with Christians who take a more lax approach to abortion in their vote choice. I don't think that disqualifies them from claiming the name of Jesus when it comes to their faith. I think they might be wrong, but goodness, we think that we're wrong on matters of baptism and how often to do the communion,
It's very
and
common. Yeah.
whether to have pews or chairs
Uh-huh.
in the sanctuaries.
Yeah.
Uh, Christian values, from a political perspective, there has been this marriage of sorts between, Republican Party politics going back to the 70s and 80s. Some of these things make more sense than others, right? Like abortion or same-sex marriage, or even something as amorphous as religious liberty. But then
Mm-hmm.
you start talking about gun rights. You start talking about the free markets. Um, I remember a book that I got as a gift years and years ago. It was written by Wayne Grudem,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and he basically said, "Well, what does the Bible say about all these different policies?" Right?
Yes.
And sure enough, lo and behold, all of the policies in there align with the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Right? What a coincidence, right? Now, no, look,
Uh-huh.
I'm saying the Republican Party is good on some policies when it comes to a biblical understanding of issues, right? But to say that they have a stranglehold on these things, so that they're the
Right.
only right option here, I feel like that's a little selective, and we start to maybe check our blind spots.
Yeah. Yeah, I studied under Wayne at Phoenix Seminary
Oh, yeah.
when he was writing the book that you're referencing, the
Okay.
politics book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he takes a systematic theology approach to kind of political calculus. And it reminds me too, you just reminded me these, I don't know, for those listening, you might be familiar. There's these voting guides that get published by usually politically conservative religious organizations, and it's like, oh, this is nonpartisan, and we just want to tell you where every candidate is on these issues. And you open it up, and like no Democrats have filled out the survey, or they've been neglected. And it's this, in practicality, it's leaning, or if not outright endorsing one side over the other. With Christianity used as a booster or an energizer, vote for this candidate because they're Christian or they hold to a Christian value. I, I'm friends with some Anabaptists, some Mennonites, and one of their very strongly held Christian values is pacifism. So they vote that we should defund the Department of Defense if they vote at all, right? And many of them don't. And that just gets to that complexity of, Christians don't, we're arguing about our values internally. So the idea that we're going to rally together and enact laws as if we're all in unison already is kind of a fantasy. I have found that arguments for Christian nationalism are usually a denominational, meaning like we're going to favor the Anglicans or the Presbyterians or the Baptists. Like we're actually Baptist nationalists or Presbyterian nationalists. We don't actually mean all Christians.
Well, and this is where you can poke at that a little bit. I think these voices are loudest, at least the voices that I've heard who are actually embracing this Christian nationalism, do tend to come from more Baptist spaces or Presbyterian spaces. And so if you really want to poke it and see like, oh, okay, so what would be the laws say on baptism, right? What would be a consistently Christian approach to baptism then? And just kind of step back and watch it
Right.
happen.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that is the biggest question. I think this is also part of the problem with a lot of observers who like to characterize any type of Christian political engagement as Christian nationalism.
Yeah. Yes.
Is to say, well, what kind of Christian are we talking about here?
Right.
Right? Because if it's just I mean, there's a huge amount, like you were saying, huge amount of diversity in the Christian tradition, historically and in contemporary sense, when it comes to politics. It's becoming a bit of a boogeyman, I fear, the term Christian nationalism. And frankly, I think that's concerning because it does diffuse the real problem of
Hmm.
Christian nationalism rightly defined.
Yeah,
Uh, so if everything is Christian nationalism, then nothing is Christian nationalism.
that's right. Yeah. And I think internally, Christian leaders need to uh, be about the business of defining their terms but being articulate about it. And one of the things that I'm seeing is, oh, well, the term Christian nationalism gets used too broadly, therefore shrug shoulders, not a big deal,
Yes.
so what? And it's like, no, 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 no. Just because someone in the media has misdiagnosed or mischaracterized somebody doesn't mean the problem goes away. It means we need to be more vigilant in articulating the distinction between Christian nationalism and something like a cruciform patriotism or Christ-centered civic engagement, and to be able to hold the two things up and show the difference, because the majority of folks in the evangelical church have a very difficult time discerning the difference between the two. You've done some writing about this. You
Yes.
you wrote a book, Uneasy Citizenship. Why did you write the book? What's it about? What are you trying to accomplish?
So I wrote the book for a couple of different reasons. I am a political science professor. I've written and read a lot about uh, political polarization, toxic social and affective political polarization,
Hmm.
where we've talked about earlier, sorting ourselves into different communities and seeing essentially the worst in our political opponents, the consequences for that in terms of political behavior and our political institutions. Some of the research out there, and I get into this early in the book, is pretty concerning.
Hmm.
There's some pretty concerning implications for where we're heading at this particularly polarized moment. I'm also writing as a college professor who works every day in a distinctly Christian environment. And I have the pleasure of working with, primarily 18 to 22-year olds who are here because they feel God's call in their life to live faithfully amidst a time of cultural and political uncertainty. And part of the book is really just kind of a reflection on that, and an encouragement to them and future generations, and including people in my congregation here and churches around the country. Um, and ultimately, that's the other reason why I wrote the book. I'm a Christian, right? I'm a Christian who believes strongly that we should, as Christians, engage the political system, not necessarily to wield power for the sake of enforcing our values, if we're going back to that term, on on the public writ large, but rather to make positive arguments for our values, whatever those might be, and to be faithfully exemplifying the hope that we have in Jesus. So, one of the things I do in the book is talk about some of the challenges that exist for Christians in this moment. I feel like there's a lot of doom and gloom out there in
Yeah.
Christian communities saying this is the worst it's ever been. The church is one generation or one election away from extinction in the United States. I think it was probably worse under Nero, personally. Um, but I think that you could easily overcorrect to that and say, well, there's no problems for Christians in the 21st century in America. I think there are
Right.
challenges, right? Whether it's legal challenges in certain states, certain big cultural changes in terms of religious affiliation and
Hmm.
demographic shifts, and just the shrinking numbers of identifying Christians. So there are real challenges out there, ideological, cultural, political. But I also, in the book, identify ways that these challenges raise some really cool opportunities for us as people of Jesus, to say, as we're approaching this cultural and political moment from an increasingly minoritarian perspective, what kinds of ways can we do politics that really upend or confound the world's expectations? So, what would a Christian political posture look like? Emphasizing humility, emphasizing compassion, emphasizing consistency, in the ways that we bring some of these values or positions to bear in the political space. So it's hopefully an acknowledgement that there are challenges, but also a hopeful reflection on ways that we can positively affect our political culture moving forward. Even if we end up in the minority or end up on the losing end of things from time to time, we can exemplify the way of Jesus is not one of conquering at least in this particular moment, but one of faithful witness. And we should try hard for the sake of our communities, but Jesus has already won. So we can be confident in that at the very least.
So there are many of us who are watching what's happening to our loved ones, to our friends. They're giving themselves over to fear-mongering, anxiety-inducing speech, sometimes conspiratorial thinking, with the objective of having a righteous country, seeing laws that are God-honoring. So a good end, right? A good desired outcome, I think. The means by which they are arguing that we should get there seem to be the distortion. Bullying, dehumanizing speech, undercutting, kicking people out of the country, that kind of thing. How would you coach us as we think about, okay, it seems like we want to, have laws that are just, that are righteous, that are good for everybody. As we think about how we're going to get there, how would you coach us on the means by which that we strive to get those good ends?
So I would advise us to affirm and seek to strengthen the institutions that we do have for governance. It's easy, I think, to be satisfied with institutions in our political and constitutional systems when we're in a majority perspective and we're not often on the losing end of certain cultural or political or even legal ends or outcomes. It's harder to do that when we find ourselves increasingly, on the outside looking in. Mm-hmm. At the same time, our system does exist and does a really good job, I think, in protecting the rights of minority voices, whether it's through constitutional provisions, through institutional safeguards, separation of powers, checks and balances, et cetera. And so I do think it's a mistake for Christians today to say, this worked before, it doesn't work anymore, we need to have something else replace that. There's a lot of reasons for this. I'm right, talking as a political scientist, but even from a Christian perspective, if we're seeking to have a righteous country and a righteous society, it's hard to do that through straight coercion or the implementation of Christianity on a world that doesn't want it or doesn't see the value in it. So one thing we can do is make more positive arguments for the faith in our personal relationships and our evangelism and the arguments we make in the public square. I just read something earlier today encouraging pro-life actors to make more positive arguments for, say, scientific understanding of when life begins. So stop getting bogged down in the cultural back and forth with pro-choice actors, for example, and saying, well, this is what science tells us about, development and human development. And, the science is on the pro-life movement side, this person was saying. It's easier to just shut down the dialogue and say, we're just going to take our ball, go home and install a government that's friendly to our values, again, in quotation marks. It's harder to engage the system proactively, particularly from a minority perspective. But I think that's a better way, particularly when Jesus calls us to be in the world, to be in a community of, for that terminology, Gentiles, to try to, preach the gospel and to do so in a way that isn't coercive, but rather shows the hope that we have. So that's a little broad, I think, but the first thing we have to do is not seek power for the sake of power. Peter was chastised for this in the garden, right? And I think for him, his motives were good, right? He wasn't trying to
He was trying to protect Jesus.
Why wouldn't you want to protect Jesus?
Of course, yeah.
You've spent years with this man who's supposedly the Messiah, who's going to reign in this new kingdom, and he's got good motives, but then Jesus immediately corrects him, right? And so if Peter can be corrected in that moment, so can we.
Yes.
And say, we might think that we're doing the right thing and we're doing things for the right reasons, but this is where humility comes in. This is where discernment comes in a lot, and accountability. And man, the more often you're able to have conversations with people who share your faith but don't always end up at your outcomes,
Yep.
I think that's just going to be a healthier environment for all of us as believers.
Yeah. And in whatever civic engagement that we find ourselves in, whether it's voting, advocating for a policy or position or candidate, running for office, governing in some form or the other, whether it's the school board or the county, whatever it might be, that one of the first calls on our life is to be like Jesus, to practice the fruit of the Spirit, to practice 1 Corinthians 13 love. And just because we're trying to get a good outcome, that's not permission then to set aside that, frankly, demand on our life to be, as Jesus followers, like Jesus.
Yeah. I think as soon as we start to think about the fruits of the Spirit as a barrier to effective political engagement, I think we've lost at that point.
Yes.
We might win power, we might win elections, but as Christians, we're no different from the rest of the world at that point.
What does it profit a person to gain a policy and yet forfeit their soul? That sounds familiar. I think that'll play.
I don't know.
Yeah, that'll preach.
Someone should write that down.
Oh, goodness. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for being with us today. Where can people find you and your work?
So I write occasionally through Substack. Uneasy Citizenship is the Substack. It's also the title of the book, Uneasy Citizenship, Embracing the Tension in Faith and Politics. And I'm on X still. I'm not sure why. I get my news from there. Daniel R. Benn, Benn. I get pretty snarky during Oregon Ducks and Portland Trailblazers sports season. So if you're into that, plus some reflections on politics and Christian culture, I'm there too.
Cool. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for being with us.